Congratulations, Mazel Tov, and Yasher Koach, Zach and Morgan. Each of you chanted and spoke beautifully this morning. And you took a Torah portion that is somewhat tedious and drew out essential lessons for our time. Pekudei literally means accounting, as you mentioned, Zach, which isn't exactly a setup for fun. But you moved beyond the technical data of accounting and brought the Parsha to life for us today. Each of you mentioned in different ways one of the classical reasons for building the tabernacle, to create a tangible manifestation of a God who is invisible. Among other things, Zach, you taught us about the importance of having a physical reminder of something. That what really matters, of course, is what's on the inside, which is God, but that sometimes God feels too abstract or far off, and we benefit from a gesture to remind us of God's presence. And Morgan, in part of your drush, you actually said that temples still do this, and I was grateful that you said that. Synagogues are the most obvious analogs to the Mishkan, or tabernacle, of the Torah. And you also offered the contemporary examples that you did of how to continue the work of creation just as the Israelites did when they built the tabernacle. I want to focus on that idea of partnering with God with creation as you drew us to think of from that Hasidic teaching. Because it turns out that there are many parallels between this very technical accounting parsha and the creation story. And I'd like to draw out just a few of them. In Genesis, we read, Vayachulu hashemayim v'ha'aretz. Thus were completed the heavens and the earth. And here the text says, V'tachel kol avodat mishkan. Thus was completed all the work of the tabernacle. And we also read in Genesis, Vayichal Elohim bayom hashvi'i malachto asher asa. And God completed the work that God had done. And then here, Vayichal Moshe et hamlacha, and Moses completed the work, using the same words for completed and work. Both sections also repeat the verb la'asot, meaning to do. And many of our medieval commentators point out that these two ideas are related. The work of creation, which is God's, and the work of creating sacred spaces, which is the people's. In each case, a lot of doing was necessary. And in both cases, after all that doing, the creators could look out at a completed project and breathe a sigh of relief. That took the form of Shabbat in the case of Genesis, and the form of God's presence on earth in the case of Exodus, a palace in time, and then a structure in space. It is a fitting end to the book of Exodus, which we conclude this Shabbat. After weeks of reading the nitty-gritty of building construction, the Torah ends, or rather the story ends, with God filling the space, and the Torah moves on to the laws of Leviticus, which we'll now read for the coming weeks. Brace yourselves. But for now, Morgan, I want to focus a little bit more on what you taught us, that there is so much work to be done as we continue the work of creation. We continue to partner with God in creation. And maybe having completed a project isn't really the end of the story. Because if we extend that same lesson that you taught us to the case of the tabernacle, the other great biblical creative project, we see that even after the tabernacle was finished, it still required tending, renovation, and repair. All the things that a building demands came to life once it was built. It wasn't enough merely to build it. The people had to make use of it. There was still plenty of doing left to be done. One lesson we can draw from this is though we're proud of the many structures in which we live today, it's not enough merely to celebrate the fact that we have them or honor the artisans and pioneers who crafted them. It's also important, of course, to tend to them if we are to keep them. As modern Jews, we're comfortable with the idea that we are partners with God in creation. We say some version of that phrase frequently in Jewish life. But we should also acknowledge our role as ongoing stewards of the structures we inherited from earlier generations. And here is the sticking point for me this morning. If I'm being honest, I'm a little worried about us on that front. I'm worried about American Jews and about how well we've tended to the structures we've inherited and which we've relied for generations. Earlier this month, The Atlantic magazine published a long-form piece by Franklin Foer titled "The Golden Age of American Jews is Ending." The headline says it all, and I don't recommend reading it before bed. Foer's basic argument is that the great success stories of 20th century American Jewry and ascendant consensus Zionism have given way to rising anti-Semitism and an increasing inability for Jews to move comfortably in spaces we used to champion. The article primarily focuses on the cultural ferment in which we live post-October 7th, but its aperture widens to explain how the social fabric of Jews built in the 20th century, that Jews built in the 20th century, has been crumbling for years, yielding a much more uncertain new world. And though I'm hesitant to sound the alarm just yet, he says what many of us already know to be true, that these days it feels hard, certainly harder than it did, to be a Jew, to understand ourselves or to fit in coalitions or institutions that we used to inhabit. The article didn't comment much on the slow drip of assimilation, which we've faced for generations, but we can add that to the list too. The main takeaway is that the ways in which we were Jewish and the structures within which we were Jewish have gotten complicated. By and large, American Jewish institutions like synagogues, JCCs, and federations are far less robust than they used to be. We may feel protected from that somewhat in New York or especially in Brooklyn, but it's true across the country. In addition to the rise of global anti-Semitism, investment in legacy Jewish institutions has fallen far below its peak in the last century. We didn't need Foer's analysis or diagnosis to recognize that fewer and fewer Jews find their ways into Jewish communal life, or that it's getting harder for us to make our way in the political spaces we used to call home. One issue here is that we've been victim to our own success. The great achievements of American Jews have opened so many doors that it's become less necessary for Jews to stay inside. And even beyond just our own community, we confront a broader society that has become less and less equal and less democratic over the past decades, which spells trouble not only for Jews, but for so many vulnerable minority groups. Many of us were happily ignorant of these features of American life, and so we didn't attend to those structures that facilitated our lives, namely Jewish institutions and democratic ones. Many of us assumed that synagogues would always be there, and so would, for instance, basic norms of how elections are supposed to go. Those assumptions were rooted in the liberal conviction that society is bound to get better over time, not worse. But I think by now many of us recognize that something has gone very wrong in both Jewish life and throughout our public discourse. I'm not here to tell you that all is lost. In fact, I believe to my core that both American Jewry and American democracy will live to see another Renaissance or Golden Age. But that's only possible if we understand ourselves not merely as beneficiaries of these sacred structures, but as active participants in them. Like the Israelites crafting their Mishkan, every one of us needs to engage fully in tending, sustaining, and revitalizing both Jewish institutions and democratic ones. That might mean pushing ourselves to stay committed to synagogue life, volunteering or attending events, or maybe increasing your donation this year. It also might mean pushing ourselves to show up at a protest from time to time, or standing in coalition with people with whom we might disagree in the interest of a more equal society for all, calling our elected officials or getting involved in politics in ways we might not otherwise. At a minimum, this uncertain moment demands that we pay attention to the structures we typically take for granted. By taking stock, by taking an accounting, we might say, we're better able to give of ourselves and do something productive. In the accounting of the Torah as it describes the construction of the tabernacle, Rabbeinu Bahya counts 248 instances of the verb la'asot, meaning to do. It's well known that a diverse array of Israelites contributed to the construction of the Mishkan, but it's notable to learn that doing making or adding or acting warranted 248 mentions as the people built the structure in which they would encounter the divine. I take that as an instruction for all of us. As we seek to build a Jewish life in which we actually want to live, and as we strive to sustain a democracy in which we can live freely and fully as Jews, we need to acknowledge and we need to act. This morning's B'nai Mitzvah and naming are harbingers of good things to come for our people. All around us are signs for hope, even as we continue to read troubling headlines. But taken together, we should hear a call to take notice, to act, to do, to nurture the institutions upon which we've long relied, and to make those institutions stronger than the structures we inherited. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.